So we're talking about the cardiovascular system, and that's kind of where we left off last class. And I mentioned that I was going to go and cover a little bit more of the cardiovascular system today. That I was going to do some of that this class. There's a bunch of really cool things about the cardiovascular system that we need to know and be aware of that's going on when the heart is exercising, right? So we're going to cover some of that stuff. But also, you know, give me a pulse check if you're having like any struggles, or how things are going with your assignments and drills and that sort of thing. Okay, so you can give me a private chat on that. And I think what we're going to do is probably in our next class on Wednesday is kind of go over and make sure that we're on cue for our assignments and that sort of thing. We might be able to get some time to go into that today as well. We good with that? Chris says he's just struggling with math. I'm right there with you, buddy. I'm right there with you. When I was doing my associate's degree, I had to take intermediate algebra, and man, I got a tutor, and I would bribe her with Snickers bars. I kid you not. She was not a fitness person, not at all. Right, and I'd be writing these algebraic formulas on the chalkboard, and she'd be just rubbing her head. She'd be like, "Oh, you're obviously not getting this at all." I'm like, "It's only been 2 hours." I would just hand her over another Snickers bar. She'd be good for another hour. That's how I passed my math class in algebra. Okay, so the circulatory system, I think we kind of covered the fact that, not all arteries are carrying oxygenated blood, but we can say that arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. And we also talked about how blood is not ever blue, right? It's always red. And I kind of messed with you guys a little bit on that, right? So blood's always red. And if your blood is blue, then you need to ask your mom where she's been and what planet, right? Now, during heavy exercise, the demand of the heart may be 15 to 20 times greater than that at rest, okay? So that's one of the reasons that we exercise. That's one of the benefits, especially cardiovascular training, because it's sustained, elevated, training for the heart. But when I look at that statement there, I kind of think of police officers or law enforcement and also firefighters. One of the things that's kind of new out there that's trending, and if we hop on board with it right now, we're smart. It's called Tactical Strength and Conditioning, and it's done by NSCA, National Strength and Conditioning Association. And if you're involved with the military, that's an even greater asset for you, because you may have had some elements of being a practitioner, not just a facilitator. For us as coaches, we would be a facilitator for tactical strength and conditioning, not necessarily a practitioner, meaning we're not necessarily going to grab a gun and go into battle, but we know how to train people for the physical demands that sort of thing would be placed upon the body. So that's kind of the new area in our field. And some of the research is indicating that firefighters specifically, okay, when they go into a fire, okay, they're met, and I'll put this in the chat box so you guys know what I'm saying when I say met, okay, MET. This is used a lot with ACSM. I think I spelt it right. Metabolic equivalent, okay? That basically, so if I say 12 METs, that means that your energy expenditure is 12 times that of your resting state. 12 METs. That, you guys, just to give you a scope, okay, is very, very high. Very, very high. That's exhaustingly high. What's the #1 killer for firefighters? Is it getting burned? Is it smoke inhalation? Anybody want to guess what the #1 killer for for firefighters? I just gave it away. Never underestimate a good night's sleep, folks. Going on 4 hours here. Cardiac arrest, says Sophia. Absolutely right. Heart attack. Heart attack, #1 killers. You know what the second killer is for firefighters? Cancer. The fire retardant stuff that they have on their uniforms is carcinogenic. And also they're going into environments that are burning all sorts of, you know, plastics and other caustic stuff. And when that stuff burns, okay, it gets absorbed through your skin. So cancer is the second killer for firefighters out there. And then the third one, I don't know if this is number 3 on the list, but something that they also try to downplay, they don't talk a lot about, but another high rate of high death rate for firefighters is suicide. So in any case, so we're talking about the #1 killer for firefighters, okay, is the cardiovascular system. Now police, I haven't checked the research on the police, but I'm of the impression that it's very similar, because the firefighters and your law enforcement are going from a state of rest, just watching, being around, like a law enforcement might be sitting in their car and then they get a call, or firefighters could be asleep and then the alarm rings and boom, they're sliding down the pole and putting on their gear and rushing to the fire, right? So they're going from 0 to, you know, 12 metabolic equivalents in a very short amount of time. Very, very stressful on the heart. So when we're talking about during heavy exercise, the demand may be 15 to 20 times greater than that at rest. Okay, and we talked about the purpose of this pumping system is to deliver oxygenated blood to the working muscles, because we have to have oxygen in our muscles for them to live, and also nutrients as well. And then it takes away the waste product, and the after we use the oxygen, it gets turned into what by our body? After we've used that oxygen, we create what? What's the byproduct?
Carbon dioxide?
Yeah, is it carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide?
Dioxide.
Good. Yes, carbon dioxide. Carbon monoxide would be very bad. That's the stuff that comes out of the tailpipe of your cars. It puts you to sleep, right? Not good. Poisonous. Okay, so we've got carbon dioxide coming out. Okay. So it says here, to meet the increased demands of muscle during exercise, 2 major adjustments of blood flow must be made. An increased cardiac output, so the increased amount of blood pumped per minute by the heart. A redistribution of blood flow from inactive organs to active skeletal muscles. Okay, and I think I got a picture of that. I'm going to scoot down here, but it kind of shows the redistribution of blood flow. Oh, here we go. Let me enlarge this because it's kind of a little bit, takes a second to wrap your brain around it. So during heavy exercise, so 100%, okay, this is 100% exercise, and this is, let's see, heavy exercise. So during heavy exercise right here, we've got a large amount, so 80 to 85% of our blood flow is going to our skeletal muscles right here. We've got about 3 to 4% of blood flow going to our brain. We've got bones, kidney, heart, okay, and our viscera, or our organs, okay. Here we got our liver, stomach, large intestine, small intestine right here, okay. So the blood right now, in a resting situation, you have 20 to 25% of blood flow in your working organs right now. And you'll have 20% in your kidneys, 4 to 5% in the heart muscle itself. You got 15 to 20% in the working muscles. okay? And right here in an exercise-induced state, 25 liters per minute pumping through your circulatory system, whereas in a resting state, we got 5 liters per minute. So this is just kind of an example to give you an idea of how your body redistributes the blood from a state of exercise to a state of rest, which is one of the reasons why we warm up when we exercise, right? So there's something else I was going to say about that. Part of what inactivates this is the fight or flight response of your sympathetic nervous system, right? You've got your release of norepinephrine and epinephrine that, or your adrenaline that dilates the pupils, makes you breathe, vasodilates the arteries, veins, and, your airways, and, that sort of thing. It also decreases your immune system function. Okay, and that's why you'll hear some personal trainers, or have you guys ever gone to the gym and done just this really ridiculously hard workout, and then 2 hours after the gym you feel yourself coming down with a cold or the flu or some sort of sickness, right? That's not necessarily that you caught a bug. It means you basically tanked your immune system or immunosuppressed or compromised yourself so that you became vulnerable to that pathogen that was probably on your skin for a while. It just happened to be your immune system dropped down low enough that you got infiltrated by it. So now what this is saying right here is that, the blood in your heart, okay, you have a circuit that goes to your lungs, and then you have a circuit that goes to the rest of your body, which is called the systemic circuit. So you've got pulmonary circuit, okay? Pulmonary, so pulmonary means basically your lungs, okay? And then you got your systemic circuit, and they're all under pressure. Now, with that, we have, where is it here? Circulation of blood requires the action of muscular pump, the heart that creates the pressure head needed to move blood through the system. Blood travels away from the heart and arteries and returns to the heart by way of the veins. The system is considered closed because the arteries and veins are continuous with each other through smaller vessels. So the arteries that we have, they branch into smaller parts, kind of like a root system of a tree. So it goes from arteries to arterioles, okay, arterioles, and then they go into capillaries, okay. So as the vessels become microscopic, they form arterioles, which eventually develop into beds of much smaller vessels called capillaries. Is it capillaries or capillaries, you guys? Depends where you live.
I say capillaries.
Yeah, I do too.
You say tomato, I say tomato, you say Al-Qaeda, I'll say Al-Qaeda. Let's call the whole war off, right? No, not funny. All right. So actually in Canada, it's capillaries, and in the States, most people say capillaries. Yeah. So, and actually one of the bookmarks that I have, as just a little side note here, I'm going to pull up, it's called howjusay.com. Google kind of has this now more and more, but this howjusay.com, you just put in the word
capillaries,
and it'll pronounce it for you.
capillaries,
Everybody say it with me.
capillaries,
Capillaries. Okay. Let me put this in the, you can bookmark this if you want. That was actually a really big problem for me in my education, because I took all my Anat and Phys classes, but all of my tests were, pencil and paper, fill in the, multiple choice and essay question and that sort of thing. None of my professors ever double checked with me on how I pronounced any of the words. And for us as trainers, this is all verbal. I mean, we're not medical billing clerks. We need to be able to have an idea of how some of these words are pronounced. So if you're wondering if you're pronouncing the word correctly, go ahead and check howjusay.com, or, you know, ask Google. Google Voice will some say, you know, you say pronounce such and such, you know, okay Google, pronounce capillaries, right? Yeah. What was the one that I was doing for a long time? I was calling it epiphysis in the bone, and it's really epiphysis. Yeah. Now, so we've got our arteries, and then we've got arterioles, and then we've got our capillaries, which are small, that's basically at the cellular level where you get the oxygen diffusion, transport, and that stuff in and out of the cells, is at the capillary level. And then the waste product gets taken away from these small veins called venules. And then venules take the blood flow back into veins, and the veins empty directly into the heart. Okay. So if we take a look at the heart, have you guys ever seen one of these diagrams before? Hopefully this is a little bit familiar. Okay. So we've got you know, our superior and inferior vena cava that is returning blood flow to the right atrium. Okay, blood flow goes through the tricuspid valve down in here. So this atrium means kind of think about being like in a tree fort or something like that with this big, really high roof. Think atrium if you're wondering about you know, your ventricles and your atrium. So atrium are above your ventricles down here. So blood flow comes pouring in through to the right atrium. It goes past the tricuspid valve right here, which allows blood to go one direction, but it's really good at resisting blood going in the reverse direction. Every once in a while, you'll hear people having leaky valves, and you know, they'll have a little heart murmur. So when you hear like their thump thump under a stethoscope, you know, you hear their heartbeat, there'll be like a little bit additional, some additional sounds that you'll hear from the heart, and that might be from a defective or faulty or a leaky valve, which isn't necessarily, you know, going to kill you, but it's a lack of efficiency with the heart. So the blood goes into this right ventricle. Now at this point, the blood is deoxygenated. There's no oxygen in this blood, so we need to take this blood up, okay, through the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery to go through to both lungs. Okay. Now with anatomy, you got to remember your heart is kind of sitting in between or just behind your lungs. So your lungs are kind of shaped around your heart, which is kind of interesting. Your heart's like kind of on the, well, over here, it'd be on the, looking in the video here. My heart's right here. No, it's right here. It's the mirror of the video. But your right lung and your left lung are not symmetrical. They're different shaped because your heart's in the way. Okay. So this deoxygenated blood is going to the pulmonary system. It's going to your lungs. Okay. Now, what your lungs do is they fill up with oxygen. Okay, and so they reoxygenate the blood, and they also take out the carbon dioxide. Okay. Now, how does it do that? I don't think I put that in here, but I can tell you guys a little bit about that. So I want you guys to go ahead and put your hands underneath your rib cage. So find your floating ribs down there. Go ahead and put your hands on your ribs. Don't tickle yourself. This is class. It's very serious. It's college class. Don't tickle your ribs. But feel under your ribs right there. Now in that area right there, you actually have this membrane that divides you know, your chest cavity right here, thoracic cavity, okay, from all of your guts. Okay, you got all, you know, all your guts down in here, stomach, liver, spleen, kidneys, all that good stuff, right? That stuff is not so much under pressure, but your thoracic cavity is under pressure. And what happens is this membrane down here we call your diaphragm, okay, will actually pull down this way. And because this is pressurized in here, when I pull down, it creates a vacuum that allows me to breathe air into my lungs. So that's how you're able to take a breath, so that diaphragm's pulling down. Now you also have, what's the terminology, the medical term for our ribs? There's a medical term, starts with a C. Costals.
Costals.
Costals. Very good, Chris. Very good. So you have your costals, and the muscle in between the ribs is your intercostals. In between the ribs, intercostals. Okay. Now those intercostals are also going to be responsible when you're breathing heavy. You're breathing, you know, exercise induced. You're going to be, you know, breathing really heavy. The intercostals are also going to help you breathe and create more of a vacuum for that air to go into the lungs. Now, your lungs start with your bronchioles, and then they branch into smaller and smaller tubes until you get to this stuff that kind of looks like a little bit like grapes. Very, very, very small little grapes, right? And we call those alveoli and alveolar sacs. And they're very, very delicate, and the tissue is very, very, very thin, right? That's why smoking is so bad, right? So you got these alveolar sacs, and what they do is there's actually a pressure difference between the air outside, on the outside of the sacs, and the blood on the inside of the sacs. See, what happens is the blood that goes to your lungs, it's got hardly any oxygen in it, but it's got all sorts of carbon dioxide in it. And then the air on the outside of the alveolar sacs that you just inspired or breathed in is very, very high in oxygen and very, very low in carbon dioxide. And what happens with this type of pressure difference is they exchange to an equilibrium. So there's an equal amount of oxygen on both sides of the sac, okay, and equal amount of carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide gets removed, and your blood absorbs with your hemoglobin, okay, it absorbs the oxygen, and then your blood starts to return back to the heart again. So looking back to our screen share, blood's returning back to the heart via the right pulmonary veins, okay, and the left pulmonary veins over here, and they go into the left atrium. Now here's where we start to get into a little bit more of importance here, because that blood goes into the left atrium and then it goes into the left ventricle. This left ventricle is responsible for pumping the blood to the systemic circuit. So it needs to be massively strong to have the strength to be able to push that blood through your whole frickin' body. Okay, so that left ventricle, when we're talking about exercise and increasing the myocardial tissue and our ability to pump blood, that left ventricle is key. So if you're around endurance athletes long enough, you're going to hear people talking about left ventricle. Okay, because left ventricle is the area that gets the most hypertrophy in myocardial tissue. So if you look down here, do you see how much thicker this tissue here in the left ventricle is compared to the right ventricle? So, and the more in shape you are, the more muscle tissue that you have here. The more muscle tissue that you have here means that the less amount of beats your heart has to do per minute to pump the blood. So your resting heart rate will be lower. Okay, you guys with me so far on that? Does that all make sense? Okay. Now, let's see. So all of that flap of the yap that I just gave you right there, it's all right in here. And they go through and it talks about the valves. And I threw in this picture, it's not on the midterm exam or the final exam or anything, but it's just kind of giving you an idea or some perspective of the reason why they call some of these valves in the heart the way they do. So this is a pulmonary semilunar valve. So if you take a look at the way that the valve is formed, if you were a doctor and you just did an autopsy on a cadaver and you're looking at that ventricle, or sorry, not ventricle, that valve, okay, you might say, wow, it's kind of moon-shaped, okay, semilunar valve. And you got your aortic semilunar valve, so that's why they're calling them that way. But there's 3 parts to those valves, and they're one way. So they lock shut when the heart begins to contract. But when in between contractions, those valves open up, you know, they don't, there's no muscle contraction to open them up. It just opens up because blood's going to rush in there. Okay. So here's another diagram of the heart. Okay. Again, large myocardium right here. Now, I want to go through the, go to the Frank-Starling mechanism. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. So let's back up. But the Frank-Starling mechanism is the coolest. It's really cool. So with myocardium, now give me a thumbs up, a thumbs down, thumbs in the middle if I'm going at a good pace, or let me know if I'm losing you on some of this stuff. Okay, all right. Because if you've never heard of any of this stuff before, it might be like, right? Okay, so we've got this in myocardial tissue, okay? So it says, to better appreciate how circulatory system adjusts to stress of exercise, it is important to understand elementary details of heart muscle structure as well as the electrical and mechanical activities of the heart. So we have the wall of the heart is composed of the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. Very similar to the muscle belly of a regular skeletal muscle, okay? Epi, peri, endo, okay, epimysium, perimysium, endomysium. We've got epicardium, myocardium, endocardium. So epi, myo, endo in this circumstance, right? So here's an explanation right here of your tissue. So this outer tissue, the epicardium, is kind of, I like to think of it in terms of like saran wrap. Kind of surrounds things, keeps it all together, right? And then you've got the, you know, your actin and myosin kind of going on over here, and then you've got your endocardium, okay? And there's also, some of this stuff is very, very conducive to electroactivity, and some of it is kind of insulating the electroactivity so that your atrial ventricular node and your pacemaker, sinoatrial node, okay, your pacemakers in your heart are able to conduct the electric waves that are going to cause the heart to contract. Okay, so in here it says maintaining a constant blood supply of the heart via the coronary arteries is critical because even at rest, the heart has a high demand for oxygen and nutrients. And right here we're seeing one of the most common defects right now in our you know, with cardiovascular disease is atherosclerosis. Okay, so this is fatty deposits that we call plaque that get on the inside part of your arteries, and they thicken or they decrease the dilation of those arteries. Now, this is a problem, and I picked a really good picture of this, because if you take a look at your coronary artery right here, we're not talking about this big thing, right? We're talking about this little tiny thing. We're talking about, like, you know, like the stir sticks that you stir your coffee with, you know, those little tiny straws. We're talking coronary arteries are not like, they're not huge. They're small, small things, right? So these fatty deposits, plaquey deposits and stuff, you know, if they shut off feeding blood supply to your heart, it's a done deal. You've punched your ticket, right? Part of that, you know, whatever that artery is supplying blood through to in your heart, it's going to die. It's going to die. So now with the rest of your body has a little bit of resiliency to kind of redirect blood flow to certain areas if it's getting cut off, right? But with your heart, it's such an immediate demand for oxygen for it to be able to pump that heart. We've got to make sure that you know, our pathways are clear. Now, what they found, and I think I actually might have a picture here. Oh, here we go. Let's see. This is an actual picture of an artery with atherosclerosis in it. And what we found in the Korean War, we did autopsies on some of our young soldiers that passed away in the war, and they were showing significant signs of coronary artery disease. So atherosclerosis right here, restricting blood flow. Now, that was a shock to discover that, because up until that point in the 1950s, we thought atherosclerosis was something that old people got. You're on your rocking chair out on your porch, and then, you know, oh, my arteries aren't so good, right? Because you're like 105 years old. But this is happening. This was significant amounts that were found in some of our young soldiers that were just past their teens, like 21, 22, 23. Significant amounts, and they're attributing it to the high amount of saturated fat in a lot of our diets. So going back to like some of your polyunsaturated fats, your Mediterranean type of diet out there, Mediterranean diet, a large amount of fat in their diet, but it's all polyunsaturated. They don't have near the issues with cardiorespiratory stuff like we are, okay? Because that saturated fat tends to solidify into a solid and cake around those arteries. Now, the other thing too is, depending on how long that plaque has been there, you will get tissue growth that will go over top of that atherosclerosis, because your body's a living thing, your tissue's a living thing, your arteries are continuing to produce and reproduce cells and replenish themselves, right? Tissue will grow over this atherosclerosis, and what will happen every once in a while is you'll get this inflammatory response of infection with the atherosclerosis, and this inflammation, because the artery is so small, it will completely block off that blood flow, that inflammation there, and then boom, it's all of a sudden it's a, you know, a heart attack, myocardial infarction. So yeah. Now there is, there's a test, I think it's C-reactive protein test that you can get to test for this sort of thing, but it's not a concrete indicative of atherosclerosis, but it's a very cheap test that you can get when you go to the doctor, and I think it's called C-reactive protein. But if you test positive for C-reactive protein, which is an indicator that you have atherosclerosis, you know, infected and that sort of deal, I'm not sure that the right term is infected, but it's not 100% indicator that is the case, but it's a it's a heads up, right? There was a famous newscaster. I'm trying to remember his name. Kurt Russert, maybe. Anyway, he is a famous newscaster, and he had just passed a physical with an exercise stress test and everything, given a clean bill of health, good to go, hopped on an airplane to go to France to follow up on a story, and while his legs were bent on that long flight to France, blocked an artery, caused an inflammatory cascade, knocked him, you know, killed him. But it happened, the clot happened in his leg.
That's exactly what happened to my mom like a week ago. She traveled, she has high blood pressure, and she traveled to Chile. That's like an 11-hour ride.
Mm-hmm.
And she got there, she wasn't feeling good. She got a blood clot in her leg. So she's on meds and everything.
Oh, but she's still with us.
Yes, she's okay. Thank God.
Yeah. I hope everything's okay. I mean, some of the stuff that they're doing, you know, for cardiac patients and stuff today is nothing short of miraculous. So there's high hopes there. But yeah, we want to keep those pumps, those, you know, sorry, the pipes clean, right? And exercise does that. But it's not so much exercise as it is to, you know, a healthy diet. Bacon every morning, not your friend, right? There's something else that I was going to say about this, but might come back to me. So there's atherosclerosis there. There was actually a first aid situation where I was first on scene. That's one of the other things that I teach is I teach first aid CPR. I'm a basic life support instructor for the American Heart Association. So I'll certify people with first aid CPR stuff. And I was the first on a scene out in the national parks at this place called Redfish Lake. It was a big family reunion, and this one guy had a heart attack. And you know, they were yelling, they were like, oh, so and so just fell down, he's having a heart attack. And you know, so I was first on the scene, and then one of my my sister-in-law, who's, you know, certified, because she's a geriatric nurse, she works at an old age home, so she knows what she's doing as far as first aid, and we provided partner rescue care for that person that had a heart attack. And we happened to have a bag valve mask there, and we had a stethoscope. To make a long story short, while we were waiting for EMS to come and the AED to get there, we were doing chest compressions on the heart, and we were doing rescue breathing with the bag valve mask. And the person revived, opened his eyes, looked around, took the hand to lifted his hand, tried to brush away from the chest compressions because they hurt, right? And you know, me and Brittany, we just kind of looked at each other, and she put her finger right there, the carotid artery, to feel a pulse. I grabbed the stethoscope to feel for a pulse. We could not find a pulse. And yet the person's conscious, looking around, not breathing, no heartbeat. And we just looked at each other and said, what do we do? The person's awake looking at us, but he hasn't got a heartbeat, and he's not breathing. And then his eyes closed, and he slowly went back, and you know, he passed away. It was his third heart attack. But what we had done is we had basically provided life support for that person by pumping oxygenated blood manually through the system. So the heart had passed away, right? So that's kind of, you know, the situation, you know, right here with your heart. You want to make sure that that thing keeps healthy, and that you're getting constant oxygenated blood to that heart, which is why we exercise. So, okay. I'm starting to get the sense that this is a touchy subject for some of you guys, and I apologize. I'm just going through this, you know, factually, you know, the way the textbook kind of explains it. I don't mean to be insensitive, so I apologize, you know, if I'm upsetting anybody. I didn't clue into that fast enough, so I'm sorry. Okay, so comparison of cardiac, and so you can take a look in here. We won't necessarily go over a lot of this stuff here, but it's a comparison between cardiac and skeletal muscle, which is a very interesting you know, comparison compared, you know, with what the cardiac muscle has in there compared to your skeletal muscle, right? The anatomy of that. But the main point right here is that your heart, your myocardial tissue is very highly aerobic and contains a vast amount of mitochondria, which are organelles. Okay, so your body has organs, but if you go inside at the cellular level, we call them organelles, right? So organs and then organelles, right? So your mitochondria is an organelle, and what that all your bioenergetics, your body's ability to produce energy, happens at the mitochondrial level inside the cell. So here's a show here. Exercise training protects your heart. Okay, so regular endurance exercise protects the heart against cell death during a heart attack. Note that during myocardial infarction, exercise-trained individuals suffer significantly less cardiac injury compared to untrained individuals. Okay, now the interesting thing is the debate still goes, because you'll hear of people having heart issues, heart attacks, and yet like they're an ultra marathoner, right? So there's some people saying, well, if you take cardiovascular endurance training past the point of health, then you're actually starting to do your heart a detriment as opposed to a healthy thing, right? But the supportive evidence is, you know, very clear that, you know, regular activity with cardiovascular endurance training, cardio, as we call it, is a very good thing for longevity and a healthy heart. Now, the cardiac cycle, okay, so cardiac cycle, we're talking about the thump, 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 thump of the heart, okay? So if we take a look at the timing of this and what the names are, so we've got systole and diastole, all right? So you guys can say that with me, say systole and diastole, okay? So systole is the energy part of the heart. Notice I'm squeezing my fist. Now it's the contraction phase of the heart, right? Diastole is in between contraction phases of the heart. Now, this can be hard to remember which one's which, right? Which one's systole, which one's diastole. The way I remember it, you guys, is in between the contractions of the heart, or diastole, the heart is at rest. So you could be like diastole. You got systole, diastole. I don't know if that helps. Does that help, Allie, or are you just thinking I was a nerd in high school? Okay. All right. Those little like memory games help me out to remember this stuff. I could tell you some pretty dirty jokes on how I remember certain parts of anatomy that are pretty funny, but I don't know if it's good for this group or not. So generally, so we've got the contraction phase of the heart, and then when the heart is in a state of relaxation, we've got our diastole. Now, when somebody tells you what their blood pressure is, right, they'll tell you it's like 120/80, right? That's like a typical blood pressure for an average person. For the ladies, and for people who are exercise trained or cardiovascular trained, their blood pressure is more likely to be like 110 over 80, or maybe even 70. But 110 over 80 is fantastic, right? Now, does anybody know how high your blood pressure can go before you're, you know, what do they call it? Hypertensive? 140. Very good, Sophia. Wow, you're smart, girl. You got some great answers in the chat box. Good, good. So 140. So what's going on here is when the heart beats, okay, so you got your thump thump, and then there's a space of time between where the heart is relaxed. So this systole is thump thump, okay, thump thump. And the first thump is what? Is it the left side and the right side beating differently? Or is it the top and the bottom beating differently? What creates that thump thump? Top, bottom? Very good, yes. So you got your atria that are contracting on top, and then, so that's the first thump, and then you got the bigger thump, the more it sounds a lot deeper, that's the ventricles going. So it's thump, 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 okay? Now, both of those, that's called your systole, and during a resting situation, you know, the average heart is between 60 to 90 beats per minute, okay? So they're saying 75 beats per minute is an average resting heart rate. If your clients are at 75 beats per minute, you know, we want to try and take that down a notch. We want to get some cardiovascular training in them. We want to get that thing down to at least 60. 50, great. 55, great. 60, that's good. 75, we can work. We can help that out, okay? But there's like almost half a second in between beats there at 75 beats per minute. Now, at heavy exercise, you're seeing this is at 180 beats per minute. Now, 180 beats per minute, okay, that's probably a young individual. Like who's like 22 here or in that range, in that ballpark, early 20s? So that's kind of you guys. It's kind of you guys. You guys could go and work out, have a heart rate of 180, good to go, right? Me, that's a concern because I'm 44. If I had a heart rate of 180 beats per minute, my max is 172, I think, right now, or 174. So anyway, that'd be a concern. But in any case, with this showing here, the diastole, the heart where it's resting, is only 0.13 of a second. So it's actually resting a shorter amount of time than it's actually working. So your thump thump and systole compared to resting and activity is fairly somewhat close. We got 0.3 of a second compared to 0.2 of a second, okay? But the rest decreases. Okay, so the heart doesn't rest as much, but it continues to beat. But the contraction of the heart stays somewhat similar. What we don't want to do is we don't want to have the heart trying to beat so fast that it's not able to fill itself up with blood fast enough. Huh. Okay. So now the Frank-Starling, it's in here somewhere. Here we go. Frank-Starling Law. Did you guys see how I looked that up? I just put Control F for search and typed in the word, and it automatically finds it in the document. Okay, so Frank-Starling Law, also known as Stirling's Law or Frank-Starling mechanism, okay, states that the stroke volume of the heart increases in response to an increase in the volume of blood filling the heart, the end diastolic volume, when all other factors remain constant. Okay, so what does that mean? Let me explain that. Okay, so when it comes to our heart pumping blood, we've got how strong the heart is and then how fast it's beating. And we'll talk in week 3 also about this as well, because it has to do with our age predicted heart rate max. Okay, so just trying to think of the best way to approach this so it's clear to understand. So when I'm exercising, okay, we've got our heart rate, okay, and that increases when we exercise, right? So if I'm right now I'm resting, my heart's around 50, 55 beats per minute. But if I started to do box jump burpees, okay, burpee box jumps, okay, I would tell you that within 30 to 45 seconds, my heart rate would jump up to about 140, maybe to 160 beats per minute. Pretty easy, I mean, with burpee box jumps, right? Now, some of you guys, though, when you do burpee box jumps, your heart rate might sky up to 180, right? Your heart rate. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're in worse shape or better shape than I am, okay? Because it's a combination of how fast your heart is going and how strong it's pumping. So you might have somebody that's heart's going really, really fast, but it's very, very weak, right? And then you might have another person whose heart rate is very, very strong. Their stroke volume is very, very strong. How much heart or how much blood that strong heart is able to force through the body in one beat, right? Might be very, very strong stroke volume. And therefore, heart rate does not need to be as high. So ultimately, really what we are saying on heart health is what we call cardiac output. And cardiac output is the product of heart rate times stroke volume. Okay? So right here, cardiac output. So we've got heart rate and stroke volume. Give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle if that makes sense. We good, Ivan? All right, buddy. Samantha, you okay? I'm always worried because I'm looking at her profile picture and I'm like, is she watching the road? Is she watching the road? Because she's, yeah. Okay. So now so we've got these two things, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but that's when we talk about age predicted heart rate. As we get older, so remember this, you guys, as we get older, our heart rate decreases. Okay? If I was to take the heart rate of my 3.5-year-old resting heart rate and compare it to mine, that little kid's heart is going brrr, it's going super fast because it's just this little tiny thing, right? My 10-year-old still, you know, bum 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 bum. If my heart was going like that, I'd be sweating like a pig, you know, that'd be really hard for me. So as we get older, the heart rate will slow down, But that doesn't mean that we're getting in worse shape. It just means, you know, because there's also the stroke volume. So my heart doesn't beat as fast as my 10-year-old's, but it beats stronger. It develops more of a punch, okay? Now, keep that punch in mind, that stroke volume, as we go back and talk about this Frank-Starling Law, or Frank-Starling mechanism here. So I'm going to go back up to the picture of the heart here. And here we go. This is the picture I want. Now, so I want you guys to think that you're doing burpee box jumps and you've been doing them for 5 minutes and you're just about ready to keel over and die, because 5 minutes of burpee box jumps is, you know, death by burpee box jumps, right? That's really, really hard. So in the point is you're doing something high intensity that's just kicking your butt, right? Your heart is going crazy because it's really trying to meet and satisfy the demands of oxygen that your muscles are saying, feed me, I need this now because I'm dying, right? So this blood flow is returning back to the heart at a very significantly increased speed compared to the resting state. So it might be coming back at a certain pressure of, let's say, 120 milligrams of mercury when you're in a resting state. But when you're in an exercise-induced state, that pressure on those arterial and venule walls might be 180 milligrams of mercury per minute. So really, really heavy duty, really, really high amount of pressure going through, and it hits that right atrium. It gets into that right atrium and it starts to flood in there, and it gets so under pressure that it starts to actually push itself through the tricuspid valve. So it starts to fill up the ventricle as well. So it's going through that valve, and it's going, because it's a one-way valve, it can still push itself through. It's going in and starting to build into that ventricle. Well, that right atrium, it's filled up and it's leaking into the right ventricle, and then all of a sudden that right atrium contracts. It goes thump, right? Well, what it does is that jam packs under pressure that right ventricle, and that right ventricle, it's like maybe blow your mouth out like a blowfish, like, right? It just puts it on stretch, right? And Alyssa is coming to class for pure entertainment here. She's like, this guy's crazy. So you got this ventricle, and it's just jam-packed full of blood. In fact, it's so jam-packed full of blood, after the right atrium stuffs it full, it puts it under pressure, and it stretches out that right ventricle. Well, one thing that we know about muscle is when you put a muscle on stretch, you increase its capacity to contract. You also increase its stretch reflex. So that stretch puts a power pack of bam, like an explosion of thrust or pump from that ventricle and sends it flying towards the lungs. And then the same thing as it comes back over to the left atrium, that left atrium starts to receive blood. It gets filled up to capacity, but it's still leaking into the ventricle. The ventricle might even be full before that left atrium goes and contracts, boom, and stuffs that left ventricle full of blood. And that left ventricle, that's a powerhouse of muscle right there. And when that left ventricle explodes, boom, pushes that blood. Okay, so this increased demand of this increased exercise intensity will put the heart muscle in a state of stretch, and that is what we're calling the Frank-Starling mechanism, or Frank-Starling law. Again, states that the stroke volume of the heart increases in response to an increase in the volume of blood filling the heart, the end diastolic volume, when all other factors remain constant. Okay. Oh, here's that stuff that I wanted to talk to you guys about, gas responses in the lungs. So this is how the air will diffusion, okay, into the lungs. And that gets into altitude training. because it's a it's a pressurized gradient right here. So right where you guys are, I don't know how you guys are ocean level right now, living at sea level right now. Anybody living at sea level? Chris is. Nobody else that lucky? Doggone. So Chris is at sea level. There's a large amount of oxygen in that lower altitude, right? So when he breathes in, there's lots of oxygen in that air. So lots of oxygen is going to diffuse into the lungs to create that homeostasis or that equilibrium. So every time he breathes in, he's getting more oxygen than some of the rest of you guys who are living in like Montana or Cowpie High of Alaska or whatever, right? Because there's the higher in the atmosphere, the less oxygen is there. That's why they have to go on gas when they climb Mount Everest, because there's oxygen in the air, but the pressure of oxygen is not sufficient enough to diffuse enough oxygen in your blood to help the working muscles do their job. So you're slowly dying up there in Everest, Mount Everest, unless you're on supplemental oxygen, because there's oxygen up there. It's just not enough to diffuse into the lungs and go into the blood. So this is where we call it, the diffusion or gas exchange of the lungs. And there's your alveoli. I told you they look like a bunch of grapes, right? Yeah, precious little suckers. Keep care of them, right? One of the things that smoking does is it causes adrenaline to be released into your system. So people take a drag of that cigarette and they think, oh, this is going to calm me down. Well, initially it gives that those feelings of euphoria and that sort of thing of calming you down, but it actually releases epinephrine, which is stress, fight or flight. It also vasoconstricts your arteries, okay, and it causes the platelets in your red blood cells, or platelets in your blood, to get sticky, so they clot easier, right? So you combine vasoconstriction of your circulatory system with sticky platelets in your blood, okay? That is why smoking significantly increases your chances of cardiovascular disease. Right from the very first day you smoke, you increase your chances of a heart attack by something crazy, like 40% or something. You'll have to double check those numbers because I don't think they're right, but it's somewhere close. It's like, wow, it's like, my goodness, potential heart attack. And the day you quit, it decreases, it drops significantly because of those factors there. All right, you guys. So on Wednesday, we're going to talk about how things were with the step test, because you guys did the step test, right? And you guys also did the Rockport walk test. We talked about formulas last week. We're going to talk a little bit about how those went, and we're going to talk about this upcoming week's assignment for you guys. Yeah, very, very cool class. I like this class, and the cardiovascular system. You don't have to have everything memorized, but it's really, really good. It's really good to have an understanding of how all this stuff works, because when you know how it all functions and how it works, you have a better understanding of how to train it. Okay. Now, I'll share with you guys throughout this course how the books tell you to train it, and then I'll share with you guys what has worked for me the best in the industry, and it's quite a bit more simplistic than what you're seeing in the book. And you guys can be the judge as you go out and train other people. You can prescribe certain zones and that sort of thing, but I'll share with you guys what has worked for me best in this course. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Have a great day. We'll see you guys on Wednesday.